We need to continue the research we're doing, but we need to track students' progress, not just in terms of writing ability, but in terms of their own experiences.
People that are researching in sort of pockets, so what transfers from A to B or this to that or one context to another. But I think there's probably going to be some major through lines between, for example, first year comp through to workplace writing. And I don't think a lot of us are focused on that long of a time frame, say. That's probably the next thing that we want to start thinking about is that longer term thing. And we're going to have to design our research then to be really longitudinal instead of a couple of years. We're all sort of circling around what it means to have transfer research and means to go from one context to another. But I think we really need to start thinking about context to context to context and on from there.
Directions I'd like to see writing studies research take with regard to transfer really have to do with continuing some of the work that's gone on already, and that is looking at how students move among different contexts for writing, but looking at that movement through a variety of lenses. We've started to do that, of course, and there's lots of good examples in the field of that, but I'd like to see how other faculty and other disciplines look at that movement as well and how they think about that in their own disciplines or communities of practice. And that, of course, would have to do with work outside of the academy as well.
I think one of the areas that's really interesting for us is thinking about the multimodal. That is, the ways in which we see writing happening in upper division courses where students are using tables and figures, so multimodal not just in terms of images, but also data tables, and thinking about the way in which knowledge transfers not just from a first-year writing course, but knowledge transfers from, say, a first-year chemistry course into the embodied written form of writing in chemistry or writing in the social sciences in those particular courses. And I think the multimodal is a way, I'd like to see multimodality and transfer brought into dialogue with each other more. I don't think we in writing studies have done a lot around how those two concepts or two fields, areas of inquiry for us, can speak to each other. And so that to me is a really promising potential area for the future.
Far more work is needed at the basic writing level. And I should say, for context, I teach at an urban research university where many of the students are first generation. 42 or 43% test into basic writing. Many of those students are from diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds. And we, like many institutions, are facing a serious retention problem, and that retention problem is more extreme for African American students and other students of color. So from my perspective, thinking about transfer in the basic writing classroom is an ethical issue, right? In terms of what's the promise we're offering to the many students who come into basic writing disproportionately from communities of color, from lower income communities. I think that's a really pressing issue for transfer scholarship to consider.
I hope that in the future, as researchers of transfer, we'll sort of get serious about having a more complex kind of terminology to talk about transfer, and that's going to really require us to collaborate in order to do that, because what I've seen so far is that we all sort of pick a phrase or pick a term and we like it and we use it, but someone else is using it another way, and I think that's a little bit confusing. It's human nature, but it's confusing. So I hope that we can get together and really start laying out a framework of definitions, and that we can also then lay out for each of these different kinds of transfer what kinds of methods are appropriate and useful, and that we can really be thinking about units of analysis, because we know that both the individual in this moment is important to look at, but also the much larger context of history and future, what Kevin Rusem was calling yesterday trajectories, that's important too. And so I think that we have definitional issues and methodological issues, especially related to the unit of analysis.
Another thing that I think would be helpful as we're thinking about the future of research and transfer is to think about what we could do different methodologically in terms of sites of research and in terms of methods, what we're actually looking at. I know for myself, when I did my research, I was in the classroom with students a lot. And that helped, watching talk unfold. But I drew a lot on the papers when they were done, and my retrospective interviews with writers when they were done. And I think that if we can push ourselves to look at different sites of transfer in the universities and beyond the university. Personally, I'm interested in thinking about, I direct a writing center, so I'm interested in thinking about how talk in a writing center unfolds. And that interests me for two reasons. One, it gives us a different kind of location to look at. But two, it puts us at a different point in the writing process, so that instead of talking with a writer about the paper when it's done, talking with the writer not so much as an interviewer, but as a conversational partner who's genuinely involved in a conversation about this piece of writing in progress. I think that we could hear things, we could learn things about what's going on for writers when they're in the midst of it, that they might not be able to articulate for us when they're at the end of it. So thinking methodologically about other places and other moments where we could look at writing in process.
Our project and our thinking about our set of codes has really crystallized for me the sense that there are two important strands within transfer research that need to be put in dialogue with each other. And one of those is a strand of research on meta-awareness, metacognition, and this would include work by Rifan Bowarshi on genre, Runsfeld, Bowarshi, and Goldberg on genre, both of which are looking at meta-awareness. Negretti's recent study on basic writers, arguing that reflection supports development of a broader rhetorical awareness. And while she's not looking at transfer, she's looking at really related issues, I think. And of course, Kathy Yancey's work with Karatazak and Leanne Robertson, all of that strand of research on one hand. And then the other strand that I think needs to come into more explicit dialogue with the first strand is research on the role of context or activity theory and how activity systems and social context shape cognition, and I would argue perhaps metacognition as well.
I think probably also genre theory, the application of genre theory to our understanding of transition. Because there's a good deal of work going on in genre theory, and we need to understand what dimensions of tasks and what dimensions of the kinds of writing that students are doing are we considering when we look at their transitions from not just one context to another, but types of writing that they may be unfamiliar with. And this is interesting for me from a sort of teacher development perspective, because I think that a lot of teachers are not aware of the struggles that students need to go through as they move into an advanced history course or a biology course where they've never seen the kinds of genres that are expected there for them to write.
There's some great work looking at writing in disciplines other than writing and thinking in disciplines other than writing. And I think that the more we can do of that, the better we are able to really build constructive bridges across our discipline and other disciplines. One of the things, I don't know if this is a good place to throw this in, but I will. One of the things I've thought about a lot through the Elon research that I've conducted is that using this frame of threshold concepts critical for epistemological participation within disciplines, in writing studies, we're in a really privileged position that is sometimes also vexed. There are threshold concepts of writing studies as a discipline. There are threshold concepts of writing in learning, and there are threshold concepts of teaching, and they all come together in our discipline. The other, it's great because the research that we do overlaps in so many ways with these other areas in which writing circulates. The other real benefit and sometimes challenge of our discipline is that in writing studies, we study the way that writing circulates, is produced, consumed, distributed, valued within different communities. And when we study that, it always benefits the places where we study. And so we can build these great bridges, which is really beneficial. It's also sometimes a challenge when people say, well, what do you do in writing studies? It always helps me. Your research is so helpful for me, which is great, but it's also our research.
I'd like to see writing transfer studies take, regardless of how it's framed. is to pursue threshold concepts. Yesterday, I went to a session about threshold concepts, and just in our small group dialogue, we had a really interesting conversation about let's try some out. And it was so generative and so important. I really think we need to pursue that because we need to get to a place, and it's not just a defensive stance so that we can legitimize rhetoric and composition studies. It's really that threshold concepts really go a long ways to helping us understand more what we want to be moving back and forth and all around. So I really think that needs pursuing. I also think we need to look at the intersections between threshold concepts and bottlenecks and the whole decoding the disciplines work that David Pace and others have done, because threshold concepts is focusing on the cognitive, but we know there are a whole lot of other issues, and there are cultural, contextual things, why students are in college, the economic, fiscal realities that are driving, that are creating bottlenecks and issues that we need to look at in addition to the cognitive issues. So I'd love to see those being pursued together, and I think they interact with transfer studies a lot. I mean, there's a reason that threshold concepts has come up so prominently, so I'd love to go further with that.
We really need to start focusing on bringing together theories that only look at a piece of the puzzle. I feel like at this point, and this is starting to change, but we have sort of a telescope, and you can see the telescope and you can zoom in very closely, but we're losing that big picture of the broader perspective of all of these factors. And truthfully, students are very complex. Learning to write and transfer is an incredibly complex act. And the more that we start recognizing that, but also creating models that, yes, are simplified, but help us understand that, I think that's going to really help us. And I think that's what a lot of people are talking about. Certainly, spending more time, part of that's spending more time on our terminology and not using sort of reductionist approaches to study transfer in ways that seem very simple, but are really not. And I also think that we really need a lot more multi-institutional research on transfer, partly because the context issue becomes a real problem. If writing programs are doing certain things, but they're doing it in a particular context. And I wouldn't just say multi-institutional research, because that's really hard to do, and if we don't have things like the Elon seminar, that can't happen. But replication studies, thinking about RAD research and applying the idea of replication and aggregability to research. So building on each other's research, directly trying things at new sites, and making sure that journals are willing to publish that kind of stuff. That way we can start building a more broad scholarship of, okay, this happened at Elizabeth Wardle School, okay, this happened at Wayne State, this happened at Oakland University. Hey, look, this is happening everywhere, so maybe we know something now about this. And I feel like those are the kinds of things that we need. And a lot of traditions of research and educational research in the social sciences have that strong emphasis on replicability and aggregability, and I think that we need it more, especially with something as complex as transfer.